I'm James Turk. I'm a director of the Gold Money Foundation. It's my pleasure to be here this morning with John Embry, Chief Investment Strategist of Sprott Asset Management. You know, John, we met a few months ago in Jersey, and things are pretty much playing out as we discussed back then. The big news, of course, at the moment is the sovereign debt crisis, and specifically the U.S. government debt downgrade by S&P. How do you see the implications of this playing out? We're still on the same path, right?
Well, I mean, nothing's changed. There's a certain inevitability to all of this. I will admit that given sort of the turmoil of the most recent period, I'm actually a little surprised that the S&P chose this moment to downgrade. But having said that, after seeing the very weak debt limit resolution, I mean, theoretically, you should have downgraded them about 2 seconds after that was agreed to. So to me, it's just unfolding much as we had expected.
Yeah, the debt goes up. There's no serious cuts in the budget. The government continues to spend, borrow more than the market's willing to lend to it. So the central bank has to come in, quantitative easing, and therefore we're still on this path to dollar destruction.
I think there's a belief, well, knowledge. They know full well if they reduced much stimulus at this point, the economy is sufficiently weak, it would probably just start to nosedive. So they have to go with this cosmetic talk. At the same time, they got to keep spending, and because there is insufficient savings, as you point out, they're going to have to print the money because there's not enough out there to borrow. Nobody would be stupid enough to lend it to them in that quantity. So consequently, we're headed down the road to ever greater inflation, and as much as it pains me to say it, hyperinflation, because hyperinflation, in my mind, is the most corrosive thing that can happen in a society.
Yeah.
And I would move heaven and earth if I were emperor, not to let that happen, but I don't think that's the way, I think that's where we're headed.
Yeah, you know, we're here at the GATA conference in London. One of the keynote speakers, you know, in addition to yourself, Eric Sprott, Jim Sinclair yesterday was talking about 1764 on gold, and his view was that if we take out 1764 on the upside, we could go exponential. In other words, the gold price keeps rising, which would basically be saying that, you know, the dollar is collapsing. Is this something that's likely to happen in the near future, or?
Well, I think it could happen very easily in the near future. I totally agree with Jim Sinclair. I mean, he was the gentleman, I believe, who coined that wonderful expression, QE to infinity. And he made a comment in his talk yesterday that at some point gold would become overvalued, which kind of struck me as a little odd. If you believe in QE to infinity, how does gold become overvalued? So I asked him afterwards, I said, Jim, I find an inconsistency here in your analysis. And he kind of smiled and he said, gold's going to keep going up.
Oh, okay.
And I agree with him. I mean, the number he kind of put more emphasis on was 3,200 and something.
Yes, that's
and
right.
I think it'll blow through 1,700 in reasonably short order. And that's going to catch a lot of people by surprise, Because, I mean, the majority of observers, many of whom do not understand the system, in my opinion, keep talking about tops and gold and bubbles and what have you, and nothing is further from the truth.
Yeah. You know, I like to compare it to the Dow Jones Industrials back in 1983, 84. Once it went over 1,000, where it had been held below since, you know, the 1966, 67, that, you know, at 1,100, 1,200, 1,300, you know, there were a lot of top callers and a lot of people saying the Dow was expensive. What they were looking at, though, was the price and not the value.
That's right.
And it's a similar thing that's happening here with gold. You know, they're looking at the price and not looking at the value.
Well, the fascinating thing with that analogy is that back then I was really bullish on stocks, and I wore a badge that said Dow 3000, and people thought I was crazy.
But it did play out.
But I was way too conservative. I went to 12 or 14,000.
Do you have a gold 3000?
Oh, I think that's probably, I haven't got the badge, but I should have, because I certainly think that's where it's headed as a reasonable expectation. Beyond that, who knows?
Yeah, and I think that, you know, the momentum is developing in such a way that maybe some of that exponential move that Jim was talking about might be possible here in the near future.
Well, it could be, because, I mean, as you go down the path to hyperinflation, it just means that money is being devalued at an ever greater rate, and gold, being real money, is priced in this devalued money, and it's just the price is going to. People just don't seem to grasp it. It's not gold that's doing anything. It's the value of the money in which it's denominated that's driving the bus, and it's going straight down, and the price of gold ultimately will go straight up. Now, having said all of that, I mean, you got to be careful what you wish for, because I mean, the societal impact of this could be very, very negative. I mean, I would just as soon be wrong, but I mean, my job is to analyze things, and this is the way I see it.
Yeah, call them as you see them.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and you've been on this road for quite some time. I know you've been bullish on the precious metals, even before you joined Sprott Asset Management, going back to the late 1990s.
Well, I was bullish in the late 1990s, and I was wrong. And this is what sort of got me involved with GATA, because I started to analyze the situation more closely. And when you discovered what the central banks were really doing in the space, leasing their gold and what have you, it all started to become very clear. Mm-hmm. And I mean, as I mentioned in my talk yesterday at the conference, I don't think people recognize sort of what weakened position the Western central banks are in with respect to their gold reserves. Mm-hmm. And as a result, I think that the swing from supplying gold to the market, where the Western central banks have been doing this in great amounts for 15 years, now with Eastern central banks taking gold out of the market and the Western central banks being sort of limited in what they can do going forward, this is an enormous change, and that alone would have a significant upside impact on the price.
Yeah, in the old days when the classical gold standard was still being followed around the world, mm-hmm. What they would do is you can't increase the weight of physical gold overnight, because that's just an impossibility. Mm-hmm. So they would just devalue the currency relative to gold. So if you had a ton of gold and one day it was valued at $20.67, then next day you value it at 35.
And Mr. Roosevelt did that well after he had confiscated his citizens' gold.
Yeah. But basically, that's what the market is doing now. They're looking at what the limited available physical supply of gold is in central bank reserves. And rather than the central banks formally announcing a devaluation of their currency relative to gold, the market itself is announcing it for them by rising the gold price. It's no different, really, is it?
That's exactly the case. I mean, before it was done formally, now it's being done informally, in the sense that the market is, and the central banks are trying to fight this sort of perception, but they're going to lose.
Yeah. There's been some things that have been happening recently, including the fact that, since it broke 1,000, gold's been basically heading pretty much straight up. I also follow very closely the Asian premiums or discounts. Mm-hmm. And, back in the earlier part of the decade, before that physical buying came in, you'd see a 20 or 30% reaction in the price of gold before that physical demand appeared. But what's been happening recently, and here at 1,600 even, the Asian demand came right back into the market following the price up, which has been very unusual. Is that an indication that maybe the gold cartel is finally losing control?
Oh, I believe that totally. I mean, I think a fellow named John Brimolo, who's also been at this conference, has been a very big follower, as you know, of the Asian scene. He's done a lot of good work on these premiums and what have you, and that's the thing that I've noticed most. The premiums are, really just tucked right underneath the price of where the current gold price. So if there's any diminishment in the paper price of gold, the physical demand's right there underneath it. Yeah. And that's a big change, and that makes their job much tougher as they try to sort of work the paper market lower.
Yeah, I follow John's work very closely, and I follow those premiums just for that reason, mm-hmm. because I do think it's a real good indication as to what the physical demand for the metal is. And obviously we see it in Gold Money, and you see the different reports from coin sales from the various mints and things of that nature. But at the end of the day, it's the physical market that really drives the price of metal.
Well, that's going to be the big change that I think some people don't grasp, because for the longest time it was the paper market that literally set the price, and the physical market was kind of abused as a result. But now the supply-demand equation in the physical markets becomes so strong in terms of demand that it will overcome the paper manipulation, and that's when the real, I think, game starts to the upside.